Right, okay everyone. Okay, today's video is going to be me going through the Prepping for 2025 video for the approaches section in psychology. An important section, an important paper actually, paper 2. So this is the first of our paper 2 videos. I'm obviously not going to be going through each of the approaches individually. I have videos for that and I'm going to be making another one coming up. But this is more just a general video about what you want to be thinking about going into paper 2 on I think it's the 21st of June. So approaches is, I'm going to go through this in a second, but very likely going to have a 16 marker. Now, admittedly, I did say that last year and it didn't come up, but I can show you the reasons as to why. These are approaches. You've got 5 main approaches with origins at the beginning, which everybody always seems to forget about or hope it doesn't come up. Unlikely going to be a 16 marker. They probably would hit that with an 8 marker tops, but that should be something you need to be prepared for. So Wundt down the bottom, which people forget about, and comparison of approaches down the bottom, which people tend to forget about as well. Learning approaches is largely split into 2. You've got behaviorism side and social learning theory. The amount of students that don't know the difference between social learning theory, which is not reductionist at all, Bandura, modelling, vicarious reinforcement, mediational processes, they don't know what that is, and the difference with behaviorism, which is just operant and classical conditioning. So it's crucial you need to know the differences between those. We got cognitive, biological, psychodynamic, and humanistic, all very broad approaches, different schools of thought. A 16 marker could easily come up in any of those. It has never come up in the cognitive, biological, or psychodynamic approaches. So that needs to be something that you are prepared for. I'm not saying that the 16 marker that I'm 95% sure coming up is going to be on one of those. It just wouldn't be a surprise. So I'm going to go through that in a bit. But one thing I did want to talk about here is, do me a favour, well, do yourself a favour actually. Don't revise this when it comes to approaches. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying you need to do all of it, right? So for example, AQA are perfectly allowed to put the word discuss in front of that. Imagine if this comes up as a 16 marker, discuss the use of theoretical and computer models to explain and make inferences about mental processes. That is absolutely not a bang out of order question. They're well within their right to do that. They've just put the word discuss into something. So what I'm saying is, don't revise the cognitive approach in general. You're going to need to know these approaches to a fairly deep level here. And that is people's mistake. They often think they're going to get a describe and evaluate the cognitive approach question. That's actually the least likely question. They could ask you to simply describe and evaluate the role of schema for 16 marks. There is enough to talk about there. Assimilation, accommodation, equilibrium, disequilibrium, what schemas are, give examples, for example. There's more than enough evaluations there, how they're useful, how they're not useful. So my point here is, don't revise this generally. Yes, you need to know what the assumptions are for each approach, but they are well within their right to ask you to discuss the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, or simply discuss Bandura's research, or even, I don't know, an 8 marker, discuss the role of mediational processes. They're well within their right to do that. So like I say, the reason why I think it's going to be a approaches question, because you've got 1 here, 2, come on, go away. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 16 markers in the last 4 years, all biopsychology, none approaches. In fact, in the last 6 years, there's only been one 16 marker on approaches in 2020, which nobody sat, by the way, because it was COVID, and that was on the learning approaches. So I think you stand a very good chance. Now, could they hit you with a 16 marker in approaches and bio? So far, AQA have never done a 16 marker in both. They've only ever given one 16 marker every single time in paper 2. However, if you open up your paper 1 on the 16th of May and there are 2 16 markers, I think you stand a relatively good chance of getting 2 in paper 2. So generally speaking, you're going to sit 6 16 markers across paper 1, paper 2, paper 3. Historically, it's been 3, 1, 2. 3 in paper 1, 1 in paper 2, 2 in paper 3. But last year they flipped it and it was 2, 1, 3. So I would expect, I reckon they're going to do it again. I reckon it will be 2 16 markers. And again, this is just me guessing, by the way. It's just me guessing. I reckon they could do 2 16 markers in paper 1, and potentially they could hit 1 in paper, 1 in approaches, and then 1 in biopsych for paper 2. But I do think you are far more likely going to get a 16 marker in approaches. Now, in a way that doesn't matter too much, because the one thing you need to know about approaches is you're going to need all AOs here. All AOs. AO1 and AO2 and AO3 are all equally possible. And I'll show you particularly AO2, the blue boxes here. These are all AO2 questions. They come up very regularly. Very regularly. You've got Tim, you've got Jed, you've got Ellie and Lucy, Jemima and Lily, you've got a recent thing about Alzheimer's and John's father, you've got Rita and Holly, you've got something to do with cognitive psychologist. The point being, knowing the approaches isn't enough here. You're going to need that depth of knowledge to be able to actually apply it onto a scenario that you don't see coming. I also mentioned as well, assumptions. There was a question a couple of years ago on the cognitive approach that really threw a lot of people, even though it was only a 3 marker. Explain one assumption of the cognitive approach. Historically, people aren't taught about assumptions. And again, it came up again in 2023. State one assumption of the cognitive approach. So again, it's a common question, but people don't do very well on it. You're not going to get more than a 3 marker on this, so it's not an important question in terms of the amount of marks, but it is one that students tend to do quite badly on. Just step back and ask yourself, what is the general thinking, ironic, behind the cognitive approach? Wow. That faulty behaviour is caused by faulty thinking. And that if you want to fix faulty behaviour, you don't focus on the behaviour, you focus on fixing the thinking. That the mind works like a computer. Input, process, output. Process is caused by schemas, which is caused by past experiments. That's what we mean by an assumption, right? What's an assumption of the biological approach? Well, that all our behaviour has a biological origin point. There you go. There you go. So dependent on the amount of marks, depends on the amount of detail, obviously, but that's what we mean by this assumption. It's not worth a lot of marks, but it is something that is worth revising. Now, I could go and I could land on any one of these, for example. Perfect, right? And like I said, you need to know not just that. Right, you need to know a lot more than that. So you need to know, you could get an 8 marker on denial. Is there enough to talk about let's say denial and displacement for 8 marks? 100%. For an 8 marker, probably not a 16 marker. So they've never done a 16 marker on psychodynamic, so why not just hit you with a 16 marker? Just simply a 646 would be great there, by the way. 646. Derek keeps touching his penis, even though he's 25, right? You know, Sammy keeps putting a pen in his mouth. Right. So again, you're likely going to get a application question in approaches. You need to be able to apply the approaches to them. The last thing, or not the last thing, sorry, but one of the last things I do want to kind of point out here is down the bottom. They are actually taking this out of the specification, but not for your year. Be ready to compare. If you are, I can guarantee you at some point you're going to be asked to compare an approach. Oh, sorry, no, to evaluate an approach. At some point, you're going to be asked to evaluate an approach, whether it's part of a 16 marker or just an AO3 = 6 question. I don't know, just evaluate biological approach. One of the easiest ways to pick up marks is to compare it to another approach on something in particular. These approaches, right? Are they reductionist? Know which ones are, know which ones aren't. Are they determinist? Know which ones are, know which ones aren't. Are they scientific? What type of data do they tend to use? And this you should know about off the top of your head, right? Biological approach tends to use laboratories, and therefore it's more scientific. It's backing up psychology's reputation as a science, for example. Whereas psychodynamic tends to use case studies, and that's good and bad. And then you could bring in Little Hans. So be prepared to compare for approaches. Be prepared to compare. Very, very, very easy points for you to be able to get across. Finally, there are 2 questions I want to just show you, just to give you a bit of a warning, really. I mean, what has come up in the last couple of years here? Everything has come up within the last 2 years. So there's no obvious thing that's coming up. Last year, learning approaches and cognitive didn't come up, but both of them had heavy questions the year before. So it's hard to know in which way they're coming up. Last year, the 8 marker, which people did not like, was a comparison question. Outline how behaviourists explain learning through the process of operant conditioning. So basically, outline operant conditioning for 3 marks. And then compare operant conditioning with social learning theory or social learning. Obvious similarities, they're both pretty heavy on the use of environment. They tend to generally believe in stimulus response to an extent. But a difference is that social learning theory incorporates cognition through mediational processes, but operant conditioning doesn't. Fine. There is one word I want you to be prepared for here. Now, I don't think they're going to use it again, but you do need to be prepared because students get it wrong impressively every single time, even after you teach them it. During a few years ago, I think one of them was it's right near I should have prepared this really. Where are you, little bitch? It was the word there we go, contribution. Now, a spec paper, and it did come up afterwards a few years ago, discussed the contribution of behavioural psychologists such as Pavlov and Skinner. Now, this is only going to come up in learning approaches, I think, because they're the only ones that are named. Pavlov, Skinner, Bandura. There's no other named pieces of research. When they talk about contribution, they're largely not talking about the research, and that's the mistake that students make every single year. Discuss the contribution. What did they contribute? They didn't contribute their research. They contributed theories based off of their research. So in reality, what you're talking about here, this question is, discuss the contribution of behavioural psychologists, which is operant and classical conditioning. So you are discussing operant and classical conditioning. You are not describing Pavlov and Skinner's research. So just be careful about that word. Have a look through some of these. We've got a lovely Tiger question from 2019, I believe it was. 2019, yes. 6 marks purely on applying to mediational processes. 6 marks purely on applying any one of the 4 mediational processes to Tiger and the England rugby player. Loads of 646 questions. Loads of 646 questions here, absolutely. There is one last one I just want to show you. And the reason why I want to show you this is because it is a good example about why not to evaluate, revise just this. If you describe and evaluate humanistic psychology, you're not going to get a question. I doubt you're going to get a question that's beautiful, like describe and evaluate the humanistic approach. You're going to get something specific, and they're going to tailor it to what they think you don't know. Now, everyone knows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's easy. So that's why they hit people in 2022 with this question just here. Discuss self-actualization and or conditions of worth in explaining human behavior. When people revise poorly, they can only give you one sentence about what self-actualization is, and even then it's just them going, oh, it's when you hit the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, not what it actually is. This brief state and episode of euphoria where the individual feels no need, or when they feel like they've fulfilled their potential. They don't talk about that. They just go, it's when you top Maslow's. Most of the time they can't tell you anything about conditions of worth, and if they do, they get it wrong. So just be careful. They're not going to ask you lovely broad questions. They're going to get you to apply Karishma and why she isn't displaying congruence. They're going to compare psychodynamic to humanistic. They're not going to give you easy broad questions. That's it really. Approaches is important. It's easy in terms of evaluating, right? Is it reductionist? Think of the issues and debates. All of them have practical applications. All of these have practical applications. Otherwise, why would we teach it? All of them have practical applications, but you need a good example for each of those 5. Psychodynamic has created talking therapy. Humanistic has created client-centered therapy. Biological, drug therapy. Cognitive, CBT. Learning approaches has counter conditioning and things like systematic desensitization and flooding and stuff like this. All of them have created practical applications. As always, I hope this is useful. Good luck.